Hi, I'm Carolyn Ball, and I'm going to share with you the story of the founding of the Heartland Center, Meher Baba's home in the middle of our country. As many people know, Meher Baba had 2 accidents, and he had said that each avatar suffers in some form that is appropriate to the age in which he is incarnated. And so during the time of Jesus, there were crucifixions. During the time of Buddha, there were lots of wild animals eating people. And in this day and age, car accidents were the typical way that many people suffered. And so Baba said that that would be the way that he would suffer and for the benefit of mankind. And he had predicted that there would be an accident in the United States. And there were 2. One was in the United States and one was in India. So I had been living in California. And in 2002, I came back. I headed back east. I was going to go to the center in Myrtle Beach. But I ended up stopping off in Arkansas. And Joe Bender, to whom I was married for a little while, said, "You need to stop in Oklahoma, in Prague, Oklahoma, because that's where Meher Baba had his accident." So even when I was starting across country, I didn't really know that much about the accident. And I also was pretty new to Baba. So if Joe said to go to the accident site, I was like, oh good, I'll go to it. And I walked around that area, and I remember feeling just a kind of sadness. But I was trying to figure out where was the accident. I didn't have any information about it. So I continued on and to Arkansas, where I, even though I was heading for Myrtle Beach, I stopped off for 4 years in Arkansas, which I now believe was what Baba set up for me so that the Heartland Center could be started there, because I was only 3 hours from Prague. So I got to Arkansas and sort of started to settle in there. And the 2002 Sahavas was being set up in Prague, in the surrounding area of Prague, that would commemorate Baba's accident in the United States, and it would be the 50-year anniversary. As time got closer and closer, I felt compelled that I had to go to the Sahavas. And although I had some obligations, the night before, the actual accident was on May 24th, 1952. So the night before, 50 years before, I couldn't go. So I had to head that way early that morning. And as it turned out, even though I didn't realize it at the time, I was driving to get to the ceremony that was going to be right at the accident site. And I was driving as quickly as I could down the same road that Baba was driving. And I actually pulled into the accident site at 10:15, which was to the minute, 50 years after Baba's accident. There's a lot to know about the accident itself, and the Sahavas that was being held that weekend was a powerful commemoration. And there were people there who had, Charmian Deuce, for one, had actually been arrived shortly afterwards and helped with all the things that had to be done around the time that Baba was being cared for in the hospital there. Baba was in the hospital for about, I think it was 12 days, and then he was taken with the women Mandali back to Myrtle Beach. But the accident, Sahavas, was filled with Baba's energy. It was just profound. And everyone who spoke, I remember Esfandiar was there, and several people had actually worked on creating awareness of Prague and the accident. the women Mandali themselves were not enthusiastic about talking about it at all. It had been a lot of suffering for them. But in that Sahavas, Baba's energy just permeated and pervaded the entire experience. And I was going around, again, a relatively new Baba lover. I had written my book, Meher Baba's Next Wave, but that was kind of my coming to Baba experience, writing that book. So I didn't know that much about being a Baba lover. But as I was walking around that Sahavas and just feeling Baba's presence there and really experiencing the love and also contemplating the sacrifice, I kept saying, this is Baba's Calvary. There needs to be some kind of center here. And I'd go around and ask the experienced Baba lovers, don't you think there should be a center here? And they'd all go, oh yes, there should be. But nobody was talking about it or doing anything about it. And so I would say, well, don't you think somebody ought to start something? Oh yes. And somebody finally said to me, why don't you just get up and announce that there's going to be a get together and people are going to talk about starting a center here. And I'm like, okay, I'll announce it. And I did. And then a bunch of us got together. Maybe there were 10, 12 people. Everybody was very enthusiastic. And since I'd called it, I was kind of gathering people together. And I said, who would like to run this? You know, somebody needs to be in charge. And they said, you want to. And I went, no, I'm new to Baba. I know. And everybody, it was unanimous. I should be the president. And we put together a board and we got it started. I mean, at least the legal aspects of it. I went back to Fayetteville, Arkansas, where I lived after the Sahavas, just filled with excitement and enthusiasm about putting this center together. And I had started other centers in the past, so it wasn't out of the realm of possibility. I'd had some experience with that. One of the things we had to do was file the legal papers. So we became a corporation in Oklahoma, and of course, since I'm right over the border from Oklahoma, it was pretty easy for me to make connections into that state. And then the next thing we had to do was file for the nonprofit status, 501c3. So I filled out all the paperwork, and I'd done that before. And our board was interesting. We had somebody on the East Coast, somebody on the West Coast, somebody in the North, and somebody down in Texas. So here I was near Prague, Oklahoma, in the middle of the country, and in the four directions there were board members. So it was very exciting to kind of feel every time we had a board meeting to experience this kind of the four directions, which of course was also a reflection on the fact that Baba somewhat traveled the trail of tears as he was coming across to the accident, and also that whole area is a very powerful Native American hub, and where many of the Eastern Band of Cherokees and others were stationed when they were moved. So in any case, I got the paperwork together, and the board voted we were going to become the Avatar Meher Baba Heartland Center. I sent the paperwork in, and we were only maybe 2-3 weeks out from Baba's Silence Day, July 10th. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if the corporation was stamped as official and was born on Baba's Silence Day? And so I was just hoping that would somehow happen. But on July 9th, the paperwork showed up in my mailbox, and I had forgotten to sign one of the lines on the paper. So I was very disappointed. There was no way we were going to be stamped on the, it would have to travel from Fayetteville, Arkansas down to down to 40, the southern, the route down the south part of Arkansas, get across to Oklahoma City, get into the halls of, wherever they decide these things, to the desk of the person in charge of stamping. It would have to happen in one day. And I was like, well, okay, that's not going to happen. But anyhow, it was a nice thought. 2 weeks later, the paperwork came back, And I opened it up, and it was stamped July 10th. And I was like, boy, that avatar, he can do whatever he wants. He did. That was absolutely impossible. And in fact, July 10th was, that particular July 10th of 2002 was the 77th anniversary of Baba's silence, as well as the 50th anniversary of the end of the complicated free life and the beginning of the full free life. So it felt like from the very beginning that Baba's stamp of approval was on this mission. And as I continued on working on the project, two of his mandali, Bal Natu and Bal Kachuri, were corresponding with me and talking to me. And Bal Natu told me something that as a new Baba lover I had never heard before. And that is that Baba had predicted that there would be a center in the middle of the country. And Prague, Oklahoma is pretty close to the actual center of the United States. So the project began, and once we had established that we were a nonprofit corporation, we could raise funds. And so Jim Watson was the vice president of the board, and he was very instrumental in raising enough money for us to hopefully buy the piece of property across the street from the actual accident. The people, the Mukas who were on the accident side, did not want to sell, and they were not interested. But a gentleman named Jim, I'll just call him Jim, that's his first name, lived across the street. And Jim was a very interesting character. I got to kind of be friends with him. And one of the things that he told me, he owned the property that was straight across. It was flat, but there was a big hill next to, across the street from the accident itself. And Jim's had grown up in that big house on the top of the hill. And he said even as a little boy, he would look down at the mailman coming down the road. Now the accident was actually, the town that actually happened to is Meeker, not Prague. The hospital was in Prague, but the actual place was Meeker. So the mailman would come down from Meeker, and that was the end of Meeker. And he would turn around in front of that house and head back. And Jim said even as a little boy, every time he saw that mail truck swing around in the middle of the road by that hill, he would say, boy, someday there's going to be an accident. And he was there when the accident happened. And he went down as other people did, and he saw the accident there. And it was exactly as his intuition had happened, because what had occurred is that the mail truck had swung around in front of this other person traveling from Meeker, causing that person to swerve, and that's what brought him into the lane in front of Baba. Of course, we know that Baba orchestrated all of that, and all of the things that transpired as we were setting up the Heartland Center. So Jim agreed to sell the property, and we were very excited. We raised enough money to pay for it. And we were ready to go close on it, and then he calls up, he goes, oh, I don't know, I just can't do it. And so, okay, we backed off, and we continued to negotiate and talk with him, and then he decided, okay, I'm going to go ahead and sell it. And so we got all the paperwork done and went to file the papers, and he calls up, he goes, no, I just can't do it. This happened 5 times. The last time he calls up and he just says, this is my home place. This is where I grew up, and this is where this property needs to belong to my children. And we had even offered him a life estate, and he said, but they would not forgive me if I let go of this. We were actually in the city hall ready to file the papers. We were actually inside the building with the papers in our hands, and probably 10 minutes later we would have owned that property. But we couldn't, even though we were so close, we could have pulled it off, but of course we couldn't possibly do something like that, so we withdrew. and went back to Arkansas. And for a while, we didn't know what we were going to do. The two options of buying property had dematerialized. So, but then there's a woman named Lynn Wilhite, and she had moved recently to Prague, and she had kind of kept a connection with the hospital, and the hospital in Prague had been wonderful about keeping Baba's picture there and a bunch of Baba books there, and she had kind of been the connection there. And she called me up and she said, the Burlison house is for sale. Now, the Burlison house was the home of Dr. Burlison, who was Baba's doctor and the doctor for all of the women Mandali who were in his hospital. The Burlison house was down the walkway from the hospital. He had actually built the hospital adjacent to his home. So, and we had actually also been interested maybe buying the hospital, but that was out of our range. So all of a sudden, the Burlison house is for sale, and we get really excited again. Okay, we're back in action. And we put the word out. It was going to cost a lot more than we had. So we kind of put the word out. We thought maybe somebody with some money would buy it. But nobody came forward. And then Bal Kachuri came to town and to Myrtle Beach. And so I headed down to Myrtle Beach. And I was there. Lynn was there. And it was very interesting because it was the next anniversary of, or it might have been a couple years later at that point, but it was still May 24th, the anniversary of Baba's accident. So Lynn and I are there, and Bao is talking about the Passion of Christ, and the whole time he was visiting, all he could do was talk about Baba's suffering. And that movie, The Passion of Christ, was hot, out in the theaters at that time, and of course, because Bao was around Baba when he suffered so much, especially at the end, he was very much consumed with thinking about Baba and his suffering. In the meantime, there are Lynn and myself thinking about this, commemorating Baba's suffering in Prague. So I begged for a wee bit of time to stand up and just say some words, because of course people didn't want to hear me, they wanted to hear Bao. But Dennis gave permission for me to say a little bit about the Heartland Center and about Baba's accident there. And when I did, I mentioned that the Burlison house was for sale. And if anybody wanted to buy it, then maybe we could keep moving forward with the Heartland Center. Well, in the audience was Debbie Nordine, and Debbie felt moved to step up and do the fundraising. So even though, I guess it had been about 3 years at this point, Debbie came on the board and she became our fundraiser. Well, Debbie is a dynamo, and we actually needed $160,000. And I said, if you can raise all of that, then we'll buy the house. And she said, well, I'm going to India in December, but I'll see what I can do. She had raised most of it before they were going, I think it was actually November that year, but before they were ready to leave, they had raised almost all of it. And I said, we can't buy it if we don't have all of it. And she said, well, we're leaving. And I said, but that was the agreement we made. It's hard for me to be tough, but I had to be tough because we couldn't buy it without the money. And Peter was working on a project, and something happened with that. He was building a wall, and the wall fell down, and they had to stay a couple more weeks, and Debbie got the rest of the money. So they headed off for India, and on January 6th, it was an ice storm. I remember it was almost impossible to drive, and somehow it was like 5 hours of driving for a 3-hour drive. I made it down to Prague, and we closed on the Burlison house. And happily, the lady who was living there rented it back for a couple months while we figured out, okay, what are we going to do now? And it actually had been Debbie's idea to put together sahavas and create an opening. But of course she was gone, so I got to pretty much do most of the work for that. But it was, there were a couple people that helped out, and one was the coordinator of traffic, because people were coming from all over the country. So that was a major piece of how to bring everybody in and get everybody rides. And then another person was putting together, where people are staying. But I had to go down and find a place, and we found this beautiful Episcopal retreat on a lake. It was just gorgeous. And then eventually I realized, the Burlison house, the lady moved out, and we were going to have to, it was definitely a fixer-upper. And so I decided I would move to Prague, Oklahoma. And this was not at all what I was planning. But, so I remember the day that I left. I had packed up everything. I was essentially moving to Prague. Joe and I were starting to go off in different directions anyhow. Bob had kept me there just long enough to start the Heartland Center. Anyhow, I headed for Prague, and I remember I had this big van, and it was pouring rain. And I'm heading out, and I'm just getting onto Highway 40 and coming into Oklahoma. And all of a sudden, this crashing sound starts occurring on the front dashboard, and it's like bang a bang a bang a bang a bang a bang a. I didn't know what it was, and but the windshield wipers stopped working. So I pull under an underpass, and I get call up AAA, and they come, and I am about 120 miles from Prague, and I have a 100-mile towing. So he says, well, I can tow you 100 miles, but I can't take you the whole way. And so if you want, I'll take you 100 miles. I said, I don't have any money right now, so take me 100 miles and leave me off. He's a very interesting man. He was a Southern Baptist, but he had the biggest heart. He was just the sweetest person, and we didn't really talk about the differences in our spirituality, but we talked about God the whole way. And I remember one of the things I had told him was that I was on a mission for God, that I was trying to set up a center in Prague, Oklahoma, and I wasn't really sure that I was doing the right thing. I had lots of concerns the whole time. Am I leading everybody astray? Are they donating money for a wild goose chase? Even though Baba gave many indications that it was the right thing, I still worried about if I was doing the right thing or not. So we're driving along, and he says, the next rise in the road is, the next exit is your 100-mile mark. I'm going to have to leave you off. And of course the rain is just pouring down. And I said, okay. I said, I don't have any money, so you'll have to leave me off. And I was like, I could just see myself driving 20 miles down the side of the road, on the shoulder, till I got to Oklahoma, to the Prague exit. We pull off the exit, and there's this rise there, so you can't really see things. And then we got to the top of the rise, and we both look up at the sky, and it was like somebody had taken a knife and just sliced the clouds, and suddenly it was like this complete straight line. There was no rain. It was just abrupt, and the clouds had this sharp edge. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And so the guy turns and looks at me, and he says, you must be doing something that God wants you to do. And that became a very, very important memory for me as I went through the weeks and months that followed. So now a little before that, while we were kind of waiting for the Burlison house, for me to move into the Burlison house, the town was going crazy. Now this is a teeny little town in the middle of Oklahoma on the plains. But it hadn't been that long since the Branch Davidians had their big thing down in Waco, and Waco wasn't that far away. It was just south, in Texas. So the memory of the cults and their craziness was very strong in people's minds. So people started getting afraid, and they started egging Lynn's house and throwing tomatoes at her house. Somebody took an article out and wrote scathing things about us. They didn't know anything about us because we hadn't been there, really, except for Baba's picture and a few books in the hospital over the years. Somebody connected our website to a porn site. And I went on that porn site and I tried to back out of it, and I just went to another porn site and another porn site and another porn site. And I'm like horrified because I'm thinking the children in this town are going on and looking at our website, and this is what they're going to see. Now, it is a small town. I called up the chief of police, I think it was, or maybe it was the Baptist minister. I said, you know, this is a small town, and you probably know who in this town has the capacity to do this. Would you please, for the sake of the children and other people, tell them to undo this? And so the next day it was gone. I don't know who did it, and I didn't care, but we were getting a lot of grief, and people were looking at me like I was, you know, a three-headed monster, and it was kind of scary. But just around that time, Julia Margaret Burlison Brigham came to town. Julia Margaret was Dr. Burlison's daughter, and she was like the favorite son, or rather favorite daughter of town. She was the cheerleader, and she was just, they all loved Dr. Burlison, and they all loved Julia Margaret. And Julia Margaret, along with her two siblings, had actually spoken at the first Sahavas that had been in 2002. And they had remembered Mani, and they remembered Baba. They had all met Baba, and so they had spoken about their memories. It was very exciting and interesting. But Julia Margaret had had an experience that night, and she had become a Baba lover. And so when she heard about the trouble we were having, she came to town and she got connected with everybody and just helped everybody feel at home and feel happy. And she and I wrote an article, and everybody was happy again. So that turned out, you know, really wonderful. And so there was a lot to do to fix up the house, but we were starting to get ready for the Sahavas. So I spent a lot of time scraping and painting and sanding and gardening and getting the whole thing ready. A couple months I was there alone trying to get the place ready, and there were obstacles. There were constant obstacles. We got over the big hump with everybody's reactions, but there was a lot to do with the house, and then there was still trying to create a connection in the community, and you know, people were being wary. So I joined the church, a Methodist church. The Methodist minister really kind of took us under his wing, and they used to have minister meetings in town, and he would remind everybody that we had freedom of religion in America and similar things. But he was very kind, and I started to think about Elizabeth setting up the center in Myrtle Beach, and it just kept bringing to mind what it might have been like for her to be in the Deep South, with the types of prejudice that was going on in the South at that time, and how, with what graciousness Elizabeth managed to do something that was unusual, setting up the Mayhair Spiritual Center in Myrtle Beach, and at the same time keeping that connection in town and being a part of the church in town. So I would often think about her and kind of go, what would Elizabeth do? What would Elizabeth do? And of course she had to keep costs way down because of the magnitude of what she was doing, and I did too, and do some creative construction and so forth. So think of Elizabeth starting, you know, being out in the wilderness, starting a center. That was I really drew from her inspiration a lot. And I also found myself just constantly going, Baba, what do you want? What do you want? It was very, I read at one point that Baba had said, I can work through this one or that one or no one at all. And so if most of the time I was just worried if I was doing the right thing, but if my ego ever got puffed up and decided, oh yeah, I'm starting a center here, I would remember that he could work through this one or that one or no one at all, and feel very grateful that he would let me, be on the team and participate. We started to get closer to the time of the Sahavas, and the house, I had painted a lot of the Burlison house, and we'd stuccoed the walls and done all kinds of things to make it pretty. There was no furniture at all. And all of a sudden, Bob Underwood calls me and says that his mother had passed away, and he had a huge house full of furniture. And if I wanted to come get it, I could have as much as half the furniture, and it was almost like a mansion. It's a huge home that in Greensboro. So, brave person that I am, I went to Greensboro and rented a 17-foot truck, behind which I towed my car. And there were lots of things that happened around the rental of the truck, like we got one truck and then the lift on the back didn't work, so I had to take it back, and we brought it, finally got a good truck, and it started pouring rain. Rain seemed to be a theme throughout everything. But, and we had all these volunteers for the first truck, but by the time the second truck came, they had left, or a lot of them had left. So these people off the street helped us. And we loaded up this truck with the help of people walking by. And really beautiful, beautiful antique furniture, which Bob donated. And then I drove the truck back to Prague, Oklahoma. I had never driven such a big vehicle in my life, because I remember driving down the road and I could look into the cabs of the semis. I was like, oh, Lordy Lord, I hope I can get there in one piece. But we got the furniture there, and Julia Margaret had been there. She was going to leave soon, but she got there. I got there in time for her to really place all the furniture in a way that really made her feel good about, about the home that had once been hers, and turning it over to Baba. So that was very sweet. Now, the Sahavas was getting closer and closer, and the Nordine family had said they would come a week early and help out. And Jeannie Nordine had this idea, or maybe it was Debbie's idea. One of them had the idea that we'd have all these different teacups. So they started to put together this little tea party that would be the opening of the Burlison house. And in the meantime, I knew I didn't really want to live in Oklahoma. I had been on my way from California to Myrtle Beach, and where I really wanted to live was in Myrtle Beach near the Baba Center. And so I was hoping that somebody would step up. And one person had indicated some very serious interest in it, Michael Ivey. And he said, but, I've got a dog who's not well, and I'm married. So we're like, oh, okay, well, we'll keep looking. Well, we get within a couple weeks of the Sahavas, I don't remember exact dates, Michael calls up and he says, well, my dog died and my wife just gave me divorce papers, so I'm coming up. So apparently in Florida you can get divorced quite quickly. So he came up and actually decided that he would be willing to take over. So we're coming in on the home stretch, and the Sahavas is about to happen. And in the meantime, I've been working from 8 in the morning till midnight every day since January, and now we're coming in to the end of May. I am burnt to a crisp. And but Baba has this amazing way of pulling things out of the hat when you don't think there's anything there. And all of a sudden, all these people are coming in and we're decorating and creating the Sahava space. And people are flying in from around the country and driving and carpooling across country and picking each other up at the airport. And people start coming in for the Sahavas. And it was just phenomenal. And I don't think I slept at all that whole time. I don't know. I was in the zone, some zone, because there were a million things to handle and take care of. But I would hear from people later that it was a amazing, beautiful Sahavas, wonderful speakers and music. It was in the delightful environment on the lake. It was just Baba's presence was profound throughout the Sahavas. And the afternoon of, I think it was the last day, we had the opening of the Burlison House, the official opening of the Avatar Meher Baba Heartland Center. And all these people came, and also Julia Margaret came back along with her brother and sister. And Roshan Carawala came. And so we had a wonderful opening. Dr. Burlison's son was also Dr. Burlison, and he gave tours of the hospital, which of course is right next door, and he also had a copy of God Speaks that was signed by Baba, and he donated that to the center, and the Sufis donated this wonderful 3D photographs that you can look at and see pictures from around that time as well. People came in and just walked around the center in awe. It was the most heartfelt, wonderful, loving, delightful tea party that's ever existed. And so the opening was just beautiful, and people just oohed and awed the whole time. And we went back and we finished up the Sahavas, and I went back to the Burlison house. I was still living there at the time, and Michael was going to move in, and we're just sitting around kind of post-Sahavas, chilling out. And a couple people from the Sahavas dropped by. We just wanted to come one more time. And then some more people came. We just wanted to look at the Burlison house one more time. And then some more people came. We just wanted to see the Burlison house and the new center one more time. And so it just got blessed and re-blessed and blessed again. So it was a beautiful, beautiful completion of that whole time frame for me. And John Pogue decided he would be willing to step up and become the president of the Heartland Center. So I went back to Fayetteville and packed up, and I finished my trip that had started 4 years ago and headed for my new home in Myrtle Beach, where I'm currently working on a book about the Meher Baba Spiritual Center here in Myrtle Beach. So anyhow, that's the story of the founding of the Heartland Center, and I just feel very, very grateful that Baba let me be on the team and do a job for him, even though he can work through this one or that one or no one at all. So I just say thank you, Baba. Jai Baba. Oh, I wanted to add something. A very sweet thing happened a couple years later with the Methodist minister. Of course, we had over time merged into the community and found good friends there. And one of the things that I found was very interesting was that the town was always and had always been a very, very spiritual town. And it had an incredible number of churches and spiritual organizations. There were Protestants and Catholics and Jews and Mennonites and African American church people and Native American church people. And of course, the town of Prague was named after Prague, but in the South we say Prague. and so a large Czechoslovakian community. And so I always felt the deep spirituality of that town. And I always felt that Baba had really blessed that town and picked it as his place, his Calvary. And so a very sweet thing happened at the end of the stay of the Methodist minister. He was transferred, I think, to Tulsa, but he wrapped up everything there. And like I said, he had been a dear friend to the Heartland Center the whole time. And his last day in town, he came and he was a guest there. And so it was just this beautiful completion. And Baba said he would bring together all the religions like beads on one string. And in many ways, it feels like the needle is in Prague, Oklahoma. So again, thank you, Baba.